come in from the cold and find yourself a comfortable chair. Pull a blanket up if you like, and let your shoulders drop. Tonight's story is an old one, and it is not going anywhere in a hurry, so there is no need for you to hurry either. We have the whole evening ahead of us, and the night is long, and we are going to spend it together and quietly in a place very far away from this room. We are going to spend it outside the walls of an ancient city, in a camp full of tents, with the firelight low and the smell of dust and timber and cooking bread hanging in the air. We are going to visit the Assyrian siege engineers, and we are going to see what it was like to be among them in the days and weeks and months when they sat, with enormous patience, and looked at a wall that refused to fall. Now, camping is a very old human activity. People have been sleeping in tents, under stars, and on the hard ground for as long as there have been people at all. But there is a particular kind of camping that happens when an army arrives at a city and decides that it is not going to leave until that city opens its gates. It is a strange sort of holiday in the most serious possible way. The soldiers do not bring fishing rods or foldable chairs. They bring pickaxes and saws and great coils of rope, and they bring the kind of quiet, grinding determination that only people with a very long job ahead of them truly understand. So let us picture a slightly different world. Forget the streetlights outside your window and the hum of the refrigerator and the soft glow of your phone. Let us go back, far back, to a time when the most advanced machine in the world was a wooden box on wheels, hung with leather and metal, designed to knock a hole in a wall. Let us go back to the land between the two rivers, the land we call ancient Assyria, to the cities of Nineveh and Nimrud and Ashur, and to the great kings whose names sound like thunder and gravel: Ashurnasirpal, Sargon, Sennacherib. These names might seem heavy and official, the way names of kings often do, but the men who bore them had the same basic needs as anyone else. They needed breakfast, they needed sleep, and when they went to war, they needed a place to put their tents. The Assyrian Empire, at its height, was the largest thing the world had seen. It stretched from the mountains of what we now call Turkey down to the marshes of the Gulf, and from the coasts of the Mediterranean over to the high plains of Iran. It was held together by roads and by terror, but also by a remarkable, relentless, almost bureaucratic efficiency. The Assyrians were not just warriors, though they were certainly that. They were organizers. They were planners. They kept records on clay tablets the way later empires kept files in cabinets. When they decided to do something, they did it thoroughly, and they wrote it down. And one of the things they decided to do, again and again over several centuries, was to lay siege to cities. A city in those days was a promise of safety. It had walls, sometimes 30 or 40 feet high, made of mud, brick, or stone, and those walls were thick enough that a man could ride a chariot along the top of them. When the Assyrian army arrived at such a place, the people inside would shut the great wooden gates, bolt them with beams as thick as a ship's mast, and hope that the king and his engineers would eventually get bored and go home. But here is the thing about Assyrian engineers. They did not get bored. They got very, very interested. Let us imagine the approach, because every story has to begin with a road. The army has been marching for days, maybe weeks. There are foot soldiers with spears and shields, and archers with bows made of layers of wood and horn and sinew, and slingers with smooth stones in their pouches. There are chariots, rumbling and creaking, their wooden wheels wrapped in leather. There are horses and mules, and oxen pulling heavy carts loaded with grain and flour, and dried meat and barrels of water. And there are the engineers, walking alongside the carts, or sometimes riding on them, carrying their toolboxes and their measuring ropes and their careful measuring eyes. The countryside changes as they walk. Farms give way to orchards, which give way to vineyards, which give way to the bare, open ground that surrounds a city like a patient circle. And then, in the distance, someone sees it. A line on the horizon, the city. Its walls catch the late afternoon light, and the towers above its gates stand like silent sentinels, and smoke rises in thin columns from inside, where the people are going about their lives, stacking jars of grain, checking the cisterns, watching the horizon just as anxiously as the army watches the walls. The commander of the army, or the king himself, gives the order. The army halts. Trumpets sound, or perhaps great bronze drums. The men stop, and there is a collective noise of thousands of people catching their breath, unhitching their loads, stamping the dust from their sandals. And this is the moment when the siege engineers take over, because an army does not simply sit down in a field. An army makes a camp, and not just any camp, a camp that is itself a kind of fortress, a small city of canvas and wood and earth, designed to protect the besiegers from the very people they are besieging. The first thing the engineers do is choose the ground. They look for a spot that is slightly elevated or gently sloping, so that rainwater does not pool in the tents. They look for ground that is close enough to the city that the army can watch its gates, but far enough away that the defenders, archers, cannot reach them with a lucky arrow. Sometimes that distance is about 200 paces, sometimes a little more. They look for a source of water nearby. This is important, and it is the kind of detail that romantic stories about battles always forget. Armies need to drink. Thousands of men and animals require an enormous amount of water every single day, and that water has to come from somewhere. So the engineers find a river or a stream, or they dig wells in the soft ground, and they make sure that the camp is never truly thirsty. They also look for wood for tent poles, and for fires, and for the great machines that will soon be built. The countryside around a city that is about to be besieged has a strange fate. The orchards that the farmers planted with such care, and the vineyards that they tended, and the little copses of trees where birds used to sing, will all be systematically cut down. The engineers will take the wood, and the soldiers will take the fruit, and within a few days, the green landscape will be as bare as a tabletop. The people on the walls will watch this happen, and they will understand exactly what it means. Their trees are becoming ladders. Their trees are becoming ramps. Their trees are becoming the bones of terrible machines. Once the ground is chosen, the business of building the camp begins, and it is a business that follows rules older than any of these people. The camp is laid out as a rectangle, or sometimes a rounded shape that follows the gentle curves of the terrain. Around its perimeter, the soldiers dig a ditch, and the dirt from that ditch is piled up behind it to make a rampart, a low wall of earth. On top of the rampart, they build a palisade of sharpened stakes, woven together with brush, so that the whole camp looks, from a distance, like a very untidy hedge, but a hedge with a bad attitude. Along the rampart, at regular intervals, they raise wooden towers. These are not siege towers, not yet. They are watchtowers, so that guards can stand above the surrounding ground and see anyone approaching, friend or enemy, long before they get close. The camp has gates too, usually 4 of them, one on each side, and the main gate faces the city. It is a sturdy structure of timber, wide enough for a cart or a unit of soldiers to pass through in formation, and it closes at night with a great thud and the rattle of chains and the sliding of heavy bars. Inside the camp, there are streets, not the accidental paths that form when people wander around a campsite, but deliberate, straight lanes laid out with measuring ropes and stakes. The tents are arranged in rows, like terraced houses, with the smaller tents for the common soldiers nearest the rampart, and the larger tents for the officers toward the middle. There are areas for cooking, with long hearths where the bread is baked in great flat sheets, and the stew is boiled in cauldrons the size of bathtubs. There are areas for the horses, and the mules, and the oxen, low-roofed shelters, where the animals can chew their fodder in the evening and doze in the warm smell of dung and straw. There are workshops open to the sky, where the blacksmiths set up their anvils and the carpenters spread out their planks, and where the sawdust piles up around the legs of the benches like golden snow. But the heart of the camp, the place toward which all the streets converge, is the tent or the pavilion of the commander or the king. It is a great tent made of heavy woven wool, dyed in stripes of red and blue and white, and it is supported by a forest of poles, and it has rooms within rooms, separated by curtains, so that a king can retire to his private sleeping chamber and pretend for a little while that he is not sleeping on the dusty ground of a foreign field. Around this tent, there is an open space, a sort of parade ground, where the king can address his troops, and where messengers arrive and depart at a run, and where the standards of the army are planted, the poles topped with bronze emblems, the sun disk, and the symbols of the gods. And now, let us talk about the engineers themselves, because they are the people at the center of this story, and they deserve to be introduced properly. In the Assyrian army, the siege engineers were not exactly soldiers, and not exactly laborers, but something in between. They were craftsmen, mostly, carpenters, stonecutters, smiths, and men who had grown up building things, repairing things, looking at structures, and understanding how they held together and where they might be made to fall apart. They were the kind of men who could look at a city wall and see it not as an obstacle, but as a problem. And a problem is something that can be worked on. In the official inscriptions, these men are rarely mentioned by name. The kings took credit for everything. When the city fell, the royal scribes would write something like, "I myself laid siege to the city. I built a ramp against its wall. I breached it with battering rams, by the command of Asher, the great god." And all the sweating, heaving, measuring, arguing, and sheer hard thinking, done by dozens of engineers, would be folded quietly into that majestic eye. But we know they were there. We can see them because they left behind pictures of themselves, carved in stone. The royal palace at Nineveh, built by the great king Sennacherib in the 7th century before the Common Era, was decorated with enormous carved panels. These panels show the story of his campaign against the city of Lachish, a walled town in the hills of Judah. And in these carvings, we can see the engineers in action. There they are, halfway up their wooden ramp, dragging a great battering ram into position. There they are, under the ram's protective frame, piling stones in front of the wheels so that the machine does not roll backward. There they are in the camp, with their aprons and their toolkits, and we can see the ramps and the engines and the camp itself, with its rows of tents and its watchtowers. It is like a photograph from antiquity, if the photograph had been carved with infinite patience by a master stonecutter working by lamplight. What these carvings show us, in wonderful detail, is the craft of the siege engineer. The battering ram was a marvel. It was a long, heavy beam of timber, tipped with a massive bronze point that was shaped like an axe head or a spear point, depending on the fashion of the day. The beam was suspended inside a tall wooden frame, wrapped in leather and rawhide to protect it from the fire arrows that the defenders would shoot at it. The frame was set on 4 wheels, enormous wheels that looked like the wagon wheels of a giant. And inside the frame, the men who pushed it would stand on a platform and heave the beam backward and forward, with a rhythm that must have become as natural to them as breathing. They would keep a little trough of water inside the ram, and every so often they would slosh water over the leather cover to keep it wet and stubborn against the flames. If you have ever seen one of these machines, even in a museum, you would notice that it looked almost alive. Its profile, with the long beam jutting out from the front of the shelter, resembled a great beetle or a rhino or some creature out of a bestiary. And when it got to work, thudding against the face of the wall again and again and again, it made a sound that could be heard for miles. Thud, thud, thud. The people inside the city would try to dampen the blow by lowering sacks of wool and leather cushions over the point where the ram was hitting. The engineers would respond by raising the ram, or swinging it in a high arc, or attaching a spike to it that could punch through the cushion and bite into the brick behind. It was a duel in its way, a duel between a hammer and an anvil, conducted in slow motion, with the lives of entire cities hanging on each blow. The siege ramp was another masterpiece of the engineer's art. To reach the top of a tall wall, the army needed a slope, a great artificial hill of earth and stones and timber, built up against the face of the wall itself. Building one of these ramps was an immense project. It could take weeks or months. The engineers would mark out the base of the ramp with stakes, and then the labor gangs would begin. They carried baskets of dirt and stones on their shoulders in an endless procession, up and down the growing mound, like ants working on a single furious hill. The engineers directed the work with taut ropes and plumb bobs, making sure that the slope was not too steep and that the surface was firm enough to bear the weight of a heavy wooden tower on wheels. To protect the men who were building the ramp, the engineers laid down large wicker shields, hurdles made of woven reeds, and they set them up along the sides of the work area so that the archers on the city wall could not easily shoot the workers. The archers in the Assyrian army, meanwhile, stood behind their own enormous curved shields and shot arrow after arrow at the defenders on the wall, trying to give the workers the gift of a moment without death whizzing past their ears. And the defenders, for their part, would try to burn the wicker shields with fire arrows, or drop heavy stones, or pour boiling oil down the face of the wall. It was a harsh and constant negotiation, conducted in dust and noise and sweat. But let us step away from the wall for a moment, and let us step back into the camp as the sun goes down. The activity does not stop when the light fades, but it changes. The great crashing sound of the battering ram falls silent because the engineers do not like to risk their machines in the dark when repairs are harder to make and visibility is poor. Instead, the evening becomes a time of maintenance. The carpenters inspect the frames of the rams and the towers and the ramps, checking for cracks, replacing worn ropes, hammering in loose pegs. The smiths stoke their forges, which glow in the darkness like small orange eyes, and they mend broken tools, sharpen the edges of the bronze points, and fashion new nails and fittings. The sound of hammers on metal rings out across the camp, softer now than the battle sounds of the day, more like a heartbeat than a shout. The evening meal is served in shifts. The men sit on the ground, or on the capsized wheels of carts, or on piles of straw, and they eat from wooden bowls. The food is simple. Flatbread baked earlier on hot stones, or in the great clay ovens, rises in soft, warm piles. There is often a stew of lentils and onions and mutton, or barley porridge, sometimes sweetened with dates that were brought along in the supply carts. There is beer, too. Assyrian soldiers drank a lot of beer. It was thick and cloudy, drunk through a straw to filter out the hulls of the grain, and it was safer than the local water, which, after weeks of an army camping upstream, might be carrying all manner of surprises. The beer gave the camp a pleasant, yeasty smell in the evenings, and it helped the men sleep, especially the ones who had spent the day pushing the battering ram, their shoulders burning and their ears ringing with the echo of their own work. The engineers eat with the other men, but usually they gather together, because they have their own conversations. They talk about the day's work, but they talk about it in a way that is familiar to anyone who has ever spent time with craftspeople. They grumble, they compare, they tell each other about a clever trick someone devised, or a mistake that nearly cost them a whole morning. They argue about the best way to brace a beam, or whether the wall at its weakest point is really the one that looks the weakest, or what the city people inside are thinking. And they tell stories, the same stories that carpenters and engineers have always told. Stories about the time a ramp collapsed, stories about the machine that caught fire, stories about the wall that fell in a single morning after weeks of nothing. These stories are told with a mix of horror and nostalgia, and they are always, in the end, stories about patience, about the long game, about the fact that walls eventually succumb. There is a kind of intimacy to a siege camp that is not found in other places. Everyone is in it together, high and low. The king has his great pavilion, it is true, but the king also sleeps in the same dust, and drinks from the same well, and stares at the same unbroken wall that looms in the darkness. The dogs of the camp, of which there are always several, wander between tents and settle beside the men who are kindest to them. They are lean dogs, half wild, with a talent for finding scraps, and a deep suspicion of anything that moves on the surface of the wall. At night, they sleep with one ear up, and when they growl, the men listen. The water detail goes out at dawn and at dusk. The engineers have laid out the path to the river, or the well with great care, marking it with stakes and ropes, so that the men carrying the water jars can move quickly even in poor light. Each water carrier carries 2 large clay jars, slung on a yoke across his shoulders, and he walks with a careful, swaying stride so that the water does not slosh out of the narrow mouths. Some of the water is for drinking. Some is for soaking the hides of the battering rams. Some is for the mortar that the masons use when they repair the ramp. Water in a siege is more precious than gold, more precious than bronze. A city can be besieged forever if the besiegers have water. The besieged, cooped up behind their walls, with their cisterns slowly running dry, have a different arithmetic, and it is one that does not work in their favor. The latrines are placed well away from the sleeping quarters, and the kitchens, downwind, as far as the smell permits. The engineers, with their love of order, lay out the trenches with the same care they apply to the ramps. There are rules, and the soldiers grumble about the rules, but the rules keep disease away, and disease is the real enemy of a long siege. Dysentery has killed more armies than any wall ever built, and every officer knows it. So the latrines are dug deep and watched and covered over when they are full, and no one, not even the most important lord, is exempt from walking out to the edge of the camp in the cold dawn to answer nature's call. It is not a glamorous detail, but it is a human one, and it is the kind of detail that makes the past feel real instead of painted in impossibly heroic colors. Let us think about the schedule, because a siege camp runs on time, even in an age without wristwatches. The night is divided into watches, and the guards on the rampart change with the turning of the stars. When the sky begins to lighten in the east, the camp comes alive. Fires are rekindled. The smell of baking bread drifts through the tents. The engineers are often up before everyone else because they like to look at the wall in the flat, clear morning light when the shadows do not hide its cracks and weaknesses. They stand with their foreman and point and discuss, and then the day's work begins. The ramps are extended. The rams are rolled forward, groaning on their axles. The hammers begin again, and the thud, thud, thud resumes, and the city on its hill braces for another day of the endless, patient pressure. But the nights are different. The nights belong to the mind, not the muscles. And it is at night that the strangest and most beautiful things can happen. Sometimes, from the direction of the camp, there rises the sound of singing. Not martial songs, not battle hymns, but the songs of home, the songs of distant villages and lost farms. The soldiers sing low, and the sound carries across the open ground, and the people on the wall listen to it, and they recognize the tunes, because they are the same tunes sung by the same kinds of people behind the walls. Music is one of the few things that passes over the battlements without any allowance. It drifts, and it is shared, and it makes the separation, for a moment, a little less absolute. On other nights, there is silence. The camp lies dark and still, with only the watch fires burning along the rampart and the glow of the smithy. And the city sits dark and still as well. The engineers, if they cannot sleep, lie on their backs in their tents and look up at the canvas above them, which glows faintly with the light of the stars if the tent flap is open. They think about the wall. They think about the way the bricks are laid, about the seams and the joints and the places where the mortar has crumbled. They think about the ramp and how it is starting to reach the top of the wall, and they consider, with a quiet thrill, the moment when the first of their towers will be wheeled into position, and the men will step off the top of the tower and onto the wall itself. But that is a future for another day. For now, it is enough to rest, to breathe, to let the aching muscles soften in the dark. There is something almost tender about the camp as it sleeps. The tents are like low, dark animals huddled against the earth. The horses shift in their shelters, and their hooves make soft, hollow sounds on the packed ground. The oxen chew, and the chew has a rhythm that is deeply calming. A sentry walks his post along the rampart, and his footsteps crunch on the gravel, and he pauses to look at the city walls across the distance. A light moves along the top of the wall. A lantern. A patrol. The sentry thinks about the man carrying that lantern, about the way he walks, about whether he is tired, about what he is thinking. Then the light disappears behind a parapet, and the sentry walks on. Let us remember, as we settle deeper into our own comfortable chairs, that these were real people, with real weights in their chests and real aches in their knees. The engineers who built the ramps and the rams were not monsters and not heroes. They were men who had learned a trade and who were very good at it and who took pride in it. There is a particular kind of pride that comes from looking at a difficult problem, a stubborn, unyielding problem, and slowly, calmly, with immense patience, engineering the solution to it. The wall would eventually fall. The city would eventually open its gates. The king would take his tribute, and the scribes would write down the boastful words, and the carvers would carve the reliefs, and the whole drama would pass into history. But none of that could happen without the quiet work of the men who camped outside the walls, who set up their tents and dug their ditches and built their ramps, who did their jobs with the same steady hands they would have used to build a house or a boat or a chair. And when the city finally did fall, and the Assyrian soldiers poured through the broken gate, the engineers did not always go with them. Their work was not the work of glory. Their work was the work of preparation. They stood back, wiping their brows, watching the doorway they had opened. Some of them, we can imagine, felt a strange pang of regret, or at least a sense of emptiness. They had spent so many days staring at that wall, learning its moods, memorizing its weaknesses. Now it was a hole, and the siege was over, and they would move on to the next city, and the next wall, and the next long, patient, dusty season of camping in the open again. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, the siege is still young. The ramp is still rising, and the battering ram is still thudding against the brick. And the camp is full of motion and noise, and the particular texture of a life that is lived in patient anticipation. We can stop here if you like, and let the image settle into your mind like dust settling onto a low fire. The camp is around us. The wall is before us. The sky is full of stars, and the tents are full of sleeping men, and we are here watching, calm, unhurried, at the beginning of a story that will take many nights to tell. But for now, there is nothing more to do. The watch has been set. The fires are banked. The city waits, and we wait with it. So let your eyes grow heavy. Let the distant thud of the ram become as soft as a heartbeat, a lullaby, a pulse in the quiet earth. We will continue another night when the lamps are lit and the kettle is warm, and we will walk again through the lines of tents, past the forges and the wells and the sharpened stakes, to see what the engineers are planning next. There is no rush. There never was. The camp has been there for weeks. It will be there for weeks more. And you, resting in your chair, can drift off knowing that you are safe, tucked away in the present, looking back at the past with calm, unhurried eyes. As the night folds softly over everything, the old Assyrian camp, and the distant wall, and the slow, patient turn of the stars. And if you listen very carefully, past the sound of your own breathing, past the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, past the distant bark of a dog or the soft ticking of a clock, you can almost hear it. The thud, the steady, rhythmic thud of a battering ram striking against a wall of mud brick that has stood for 100 years, maybe 200, maybe longer than anyone alive can remember. The sound is dull and deep, like a giant heart beating in the earth. It travels through the ground, through the soles of your feet, through the legs of your chair, and settles somewhere in your chest. Thud, pause, thud, pause, thud. It has been going on for hours. It will go on for hours more. And somewhere in the darkness between the camp and the city, a man whose name we will never know is listening to it too, and he is yawning. Let us go back, just for a moment, to the very beginning of this strange and patient business. Before the ramps were raised, before the towers were rolled into place, before the first arrow was loosed and the first stone was hurled, there was a decision. It probably happened in a tent, or in a palace courtyard, or in the shade of a captured orchard, where the king sat on a folding stool and his officers stood around him in a loose semicircle. The city was ahead of them on its hill, with its walls and its gates and its stubborn, silent inhabitants. The king looked at it, and the king said, "We will take it." And everyone nodded, because that was the kind of thing kings said, and it was the job of everyone else to figure out how. Now, the figure who steps forward in our imagination at this moment is not the king. The king has other things to do. He has to look noble and make speeches and ride his chariot along the lines of his army so that the soldiers can cheer. He has to receive messengers and send messengers and think about the great, sweeping shape of the campaign, the way a general thinks about a map, all arrows and provinces, and the glittering prize of tribute. No, the man we are interested in is smaller, quieter, and infinitely more practical. He is the chief engineer. We do not know his name. The scribes did not bother to record it. But he is there, standing a little apart from the cluster of officers, and he is looking at the wall with an expression that is not anger, not fear, not even determination. It is something closer to interest, the way a carpenter looks at a stubborn knot in a piece of wood, the way a tailor looks at a bolt of cloth that has been cut wrong, the way a cook looks at a pot that will not come to boil. The chief engineer is a man of medium height and medium age and medium appearance. He has calloused hands and a short beard, and the kind of eyes that wander over surfaces, testing them, weighing them, finding the weak spots. He has been doing this for a long time. He has built bridges over rivers and walls around cities and drains under palaces. He has diverted streams and flattened hills and cut roads through forests that no one else dared to enter. He knows how to measure a distance by pacing it out, how to calculate the weight of a stone by looking at it, how to tell by the color of the soil whether it will bear weight or shift and sink. And he knows, with the certainty of a man who has seen it many times before, that every wall in the world has a secret. Every wall has a way in. Every wall has a place where the bricks are a little softer, where the mortar is a little drier, where the foundation rests on ground that is a little less stable than the rest. The only question is finding it. And so, before the siege engines are built and the ramps are raised, the engineer walks. He walks out in the early morning when the light is still low and the shadows are long, and he walks in a wide circle around the city, staying just out of bowshot, studying the walls from every angle. He carries a stick, and sometimes he stops and draws a line in the dust, and his assistants hurry forward and make notes on wax tablets with the pointed ends of their styluses. The soldiers think he is strange. The soldiers are not paid to think. They are paid to dig and to fight and to die in that order, and they watch the engineer make his slow, careful circuit, and they shake their heads. But the engineer does not care what the soldiers think. He is looking at the gate, and the gate is the weak point, and he is already picturing the ramp that will rise against the wall beside it, the ramp that will carry the towers and the rams up to the top of the battlements. Let us walk with him for a moment. The ground under our feet is dry and hard, baked by the sun, cracked in places like an old plate. The grass is sparse and yellow. The trees, what few there are, have been cut down by the army for timber, and the stumps stand in rows like old teeth. The city walls rise before us, and they are massive. There is no denying it. They are maybe 20 or 30 feet high, made of mud brick, each brick shaped by hand and dried in the sun, laid in courses with a thick mortar of clay and straw. The walls taper slightly as they rise, giving them a solid, rooted look, as though they had grown out of the earth rather than been placed upon it. The gate is a dark rectangle, framed by stone, with a heavy wooden door that is closed and barred. Above the gate, on the parapet, we can see the heads of the defenders. They are watching us. We can feel their eyes on us, even at this distance, even through the dusty air. The engineer stops. He points his stick at a place on the wall, a little to the right of the gate, where the brick seems to be a slightly different color. There, he says to his assistant. The assistant writes. The engineer walks on. He has seen what he needed to see. He has found the weak spot, or he has found something that might be a weak spot, and the slow, patient work of testing it will begin in the morning. That work begins with the ramp. The ramp is the great Assyrian specialty, the thing they did better than anyone else, and they did it with a kind of dogged, relentless thoroughness that makes the modern mind almost tired just to think about. They did not rush. They did not try to take the wall in a single dramatic assault. Instead, they built a hill. That is the most honest way to put it. They built a hill of earth and stone and timber, a steadily growing mound that crept closer and closer to the wall, and they built its top higher and higher until it reached the level of the battlements. And then they wheeled their towers up the hill, and the towers were as tall as the wall, and the men stepped off the towers and onto the wall, and it was over. The whole siege, the whole drama, reduced to its simplest terms, was a hill and the patience to build it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The hill does not appear in a day, or a week, or even a month. The hill appears in 1,000 small gestures, repeated over and over, until the repetition becomes a kind of meditation. The soldiers are organized into work parties. One party digs the earth from the quarries that have been opened outside the camp. Another party carries the earth in baskets, 2 men to a basket, slung on a pole between their shoulders. Another party dumps the earth at the edge of the rising ramp, and another party spreads and levels it, and another party tramples it down with their bare feet in a slow, shuffling dance that goes on for hours. The picks rise and fall. The baskets swing. The ramp grows. And over the sound of all this labor, the engineers shout instructions, and the foremen repeat them, and the words travel down the line of workers like ripples in a pond. It is easy to imagine the monotony of it, the sameness of the days. The sun rises, and the work begins. The sun climbs, and the work continues. The sun sets, and the work stops, and the men eat their evening meal of bread and onions and watered wine, and the exhausted ones fall asleep where they sit, and the camp settles into the murmuring quiet of another night. There are no weekends. There is no holiday. There is only the ramp and the wall, and the slow, patient accumulation of earth and stone and will. The engineers, for their part, oversee this with a meticulousness that borders on obsession. They walk up and down the face of the ramp, checking the slope, feeling the ground beneath their feet. They look for soft spots, for places where the fill has not been packed tightly enough, for places where a heavy rain would turn the whole thing to mud and slide it away. They order the work parties to add layers of stone, to weave branches and brush into the surface to bind it together, to soak the top with water, and then let it dry in the sun to form a crust. They understand, with the deep, instinctive knowledge of their trade, that a ramp is not just a pile of dirt. It is a structure, a piece of land that is being reshaped by human will, and it must be treated with the same care as a stone bridge or a temple wall. And the city, from the top of its wall, watches. This is one of the strange things about a siege, one of the things that separates it from a battle. In a battle, everything happens quickly, and there is no time to watch anything except the immediate danger in front of you. In a siege, there is endless time. The defenders stand on the parapet, and they lean on their spears, and they watch the ramp grow. They watch the work parties move back and forth like ants. They watch the engineers walk their slow circuits, pointing and discussing. And some of them, we can imagine, feel a strange, creeping helplessness because there is nothing they can do to stop the ramp. They can shoot arrows at the workers, but the workers are out of range. They can sortie out of the gate to attack the ramp, but the camp is defended, and the sorties are beaten back. They can pray to their gods, and they do, and the prayers rise into the sky and are carried away, and the ramp continues to grow. There is a story that the Assyrians, in some of their sieges, built their ramps so high and so wide that the defenders simply gave up, not because the ramp had reached the top of the wall, but because the sight of it, the sheer monomaniacal scale of it, broke something inside them. It was not just a hill. It was a declaration. It was the Assyrian army saying, "We have time. We have all the time in the world, and we will spend it here building this hill, and there is nothing you can do to stop us." And that message, delivered in the form of thousands of baskets of earth, was more powerful than any arrow or sling stone. It was a statement about the nature of the world. It said that the strong, the patient, the organized will eventually overcome the stubborn, the isolated, the desperate. It said that walls are not permanent. No wall is permanent. There is always a way, and if there is not a way, we will build one. Let us shift our attention now to the inside of the camp, because a siege is not all ramps and rams. It is also a city in miniature, a whole community of thousands of people, living in tents and lean-tos, eating, sleeping, gossiping, quarreling, falling in love, getting sick, getting better, getting bored. The Assyrian army was not just a fighting force. It was a moving crowd, an entire population on the march. And when it stopped to besiege a city, it created a new settlement right there outside the walls. The camp had its own streets, laid out in a rough grid, with the tents of the nobles and the officers in the center, and the tents of the common soldiers arranged around them. It had its own market, where merchants from the surrounding countryside would come to sell their goods if they were brave enough or desperate enough for coin. It had its own kitchens, its own bread ovens, its own wells, its own smithy, its own stables, its own infirmary, and, as we have already mentioned, its own latrines. The camp was a noisy place. The days were filled with the ring of hammers on anvils, the creak of wagon wheels, the braying of donkeys, the lowing of oxen, the shouts of teamsters, the curses of sergeants, the laughter of soldiers, the crying of children. Wait, children. Yes, there were children. The soldiers were not all young, unmarried men. Many of them were older, established men who had been called up for the campaign, and they brought their families with them. Their wives came to cook and to wash and to keep them warm at night. Their children came because there was no one to leave them with back home. And so the camp was full of small, grubby, energetic creatures, running between the tents, chasing dogs, throwing stones at each other, and getting under the feet of the engineers. The engineers did not mind, mostly. They were fathers and grandfathers themselves. They would occasionally reach down with a calloused hand and ruffle the hair of a child who was watching them work, and the child would dart away, laughing, and the engineer would smile, and then the smile would fade, and he would go back to looking at the wall. The evenings in the camp were quieter. The work stopped as the light failed, and the soldiers gathered around the fires. The fires were small, because wood was precious, and the flames were used more for cooking and warmth than for comfort. The men sat on the ground, wrapped in their cloaks, and they talked. They talked about home, about the farms, and the villages it seemed they would never see again. They talked about the food they missed, the bread their mothers had made, the honey that was kept in a jar in a cool corner of the house. They talked about their wives and their children, and they looked across the fire at the wives and children they had brought with them, and they were glad they had brought them. They talked about the siege, about how long it would take when the wall would fall, what they would find inside the city. They talked about the gold and the silver and the bronze and the slaves. They talked about the glory that would come to the king who conquered the city and to the army that served him. And sometimes they talked about the defenders. They looked at the wall, dark against the darkening sky, and they saw the pinpoints of light that were the fires on the parapet, and they thought about the people there. They thought about the women and children inside the city, the old men, the priests, the scribes, the farmers who had been called in from the fields to defend their home. They thought about what it would be like to be on the other side, to be the one watching the hill grow, to be the one waiting for the end. And some of them felt a flicker of something that we might call sympathy, if we were being generous, and that they might have called, in their own language, a strange heaviness in the chest. But then the fire crackled, and the smell of bread reached them, and the moment passed, and the heaviness faded into the general weariness of the day. The chief engineer, when he was not walking the ramp or studying the wall, was in his tent. His tent was larger than the others, and it was cluttered with the tools of his trade. There were coils of rope, and wooden mallets, and iron chisels, and wax tablets stacked in piles, and rolls of papyrus covered with plans and measurements and sketches. He had a lamp, and he would sit at the table near the lamp, late into the night, and he would draw. He drew the wall with all its details, the crenellations, the towers, the gate. He drew the ramp with its slope and its dimensions. He drew the battering ram, a great beam of wood with a bronze head, suspended from a frame of beams, swung back and forth by teams of men. He drew the siege tower, a tall, multi-storied structure on wheels, with platforms at each level from which the archers could shoot down onto the wall. He drew, and he calculated. He was a man who loved nothing more than the moment when the numbers worked out, when the weight of the tower was exactly balanced by the strength of the beams, when the angle of the ramp was exactly right to support the load, when the dimensions of the ram exactly matched the thickness of the wall it was meant to breach. He was a practical man, but there was a kind of poetry in his calculations, a beauty in the way that all the pieces fit together. He would sit in the lamplight, the yellow glow making his face look older and more lined than it was, and he would work, and the camp would settle around him into silence, and the only sound would be the scratch of his stylus on the wax and the distant, unending thud of the ram against the wall. Let us think for a moment about that thud. It is the sound that defines the siege, and it is a sound that has a strange intimacy to it if you listen long enough. The ram is a great timber, perhaps 60 feet long, tipped with a heavy bronze head shaped like a spear point or a ram's head. It is suspended by ropes from a frame so that it can swing back and forth, and it is operated by a crew of men who pull it in rhythm. Thud, the head strikes the wall. Thud, it draws back. Thud, it strikes again. Each strike sends a shockwave through the brick, and the brick is not designed to absorb shock. It is designed to bear weight from above. It crumbles slowly, flaking at first, then cracking, then falling away in chunks. The men who pull the ram are not engineers. They are ordinary soldiers, and they pull in time to a chant that the foreman calls out, a simple rhythm that keeps them together. The chant is not a song of war. It is a work song, like the songs of sailors hauling ropes or farmers thrashing grain. It has a tune, and the tune is old, and the words, if there are words, are simple and repetitive, and probably a little obscene. And inside the city, the defenders listen to the thud. They listen to it all day, and they listen to it all night, and it becomes a part of their lives, as constant as the sun and the moon. They cannot escape it. They cannot drown it out. It is the sound of their world ending, slowly and patiently, and with terrible precision. Some of them, we can imagine, have grown almost accustomed to it. They have learned to sleep through it, just as a city dweller learns to sleep through the sound of traffic. Others lie awake in the dark, counting the strikes, feeling the tremors through the floor beneath them, and they wonder, in the vulnerable hours of the night, whether the wall will hold until morning. The engineers listen to the thud too, but they listen differently. They listen for changes in the pitch, the rhythm, the sound of the impact. A solid strike, a dull thud that resonates, tells them that the wall is still strong. A hollow, crumbling sound tells them that the brick is starting to give way. And with each shift in the sound, they adjust. They tell the crew to aim a little higher, a little lower, a little to the left. They bring up baskets of water and pour them over the spot where the ram is striking. Because wet brick is softer and easier to break. They direct the whole long, slow process of wearing down a wall, and they do it with the calm, unhurried attention of musicians tuning an instrument. Now, let us step outside the camp for a moment, into the land around it. The siege has not happened in a vacuum. The countryside has been affected, transformed, disrupted. The fields that once belonged to the city are now no man's land, crossed by patrols and foraged by the army. The farmers have fled, or been killed, or been taken as slaves, and their houses have been burned or repurposed. The villages that dotted the landscape have been emptied, and their wells have been sealed or poisoned. The Assyrian army is an enormous machine, and it consumes everything in its path. It needs food and water and timber and stone and labor, and it takes all of these from the land around it. The city is not just under siege within its walls. It is being starved of its hinterland, its connection to the world, the fields and orchards that fed it. And yet, there are moments, strange moments, when the siege feels less like a war and more like a prolonged, awkward coexistence. The soldiers of the two sides, Assyrian and defender, sometimes find themselves in earshot of each other, across the gap between the camp and the wall. They shout insults, and then they shout jokes. And then, in the long evenings, when the shouting has died down, they sometimes shout questions. "What are you doing on that side?" they ask. "We are defending our home," the defenders reply. "We are doing our duty," the Assyrians answer. And then there is a silence, and someone on the wall asks a question about the weather, or about the price of grain, or about a rumor that has reached the city through some secret channel. And the answer comes back across the gap, and the conversation continues. Two groups of men separated by a ditch and a pile of earth, but united in that moment by a shared curiosity about each other's lives, a shared sense that they are all, in the end, just men, caught up in a story that is larger than any of them. The engineers, of course, have little time for such conversations. They are busy. The ramp is nearly at the level of the wall, and the engineers are now supervising the construction of the siege towers that will be wheeled up the ramp. The towers are immense things, perhaps 40 feet tall, with 3 or 4 stories, each story open at the front and filled with archers. They are built of timber frame, lashed together with rope and strengthened with iron brackets, and they are covered with sheets of raw hide to protect them from the fire arrows that the defenders will shoot at them. They are mounted on wheels, enormous wheels made from thick slices of tree trunks, and they are designed to be pushed up the ramp by teams of men and oxen. The engineers have spent weeks on these towers, and they have checked every joint, every lashing, every wheel 100 times. They have planned the route up the ramp, the angle of approach, the moment when the tower will be close enough for the archers to fire, the moment when the drawbridge at the top of the tower will be dropped onto the wall. And they have an almost tender relationship with these towers. They have named them, perhaps, or at least they have given them affectionate nicknames. They speak to them as they work, muttering encouragement and advice. They stroke the wood as they pass, feeling for imperfections. They stand back and look at them at the end of a long day, with the low sun casting long shadows, and they feel a pride that is deeper and more personal than any pride in a military triumph. These towers are their creations, their works of art, their answers to the impossible challenge that the city has posed. And when the towers are finished and the moment comes to roll them up the ramp, the engineers will not be angry or excited or triumphant. They will be nervous, in the quiet, private way of a man who has built something and is about to test it. Let us think, too, about the daily texture of life in the ramp building crews, because there is a human scale to the work that is easy to lose when we think in terms of armies and sieges and empires. The soldier who carries the basket of earth does not think about the empire. He thinks about his aching back and the weight of the basket and the dust that clings to his skin and gets in his eyes and makes his throat raw. He thinks about the next rest break, the next drink of water, the next meal. He does his work, and he counts the baskets, and he wonders how many more there will be before the day is done. The engineer who stands at the top of the ramp, watching the work, does not think about the empire either. He thinks about the slope, and whether it is too steep for the tower, and whether the ground is firm enough beneath the surface, and whether the rain that fell last night has weakened the fill. He is an engineer, and he is the opposite of an empire. He is a man who thinks about things. He thinks about the wall, and the ramp, and the tower, and the men, and the endless, intricate, interlocking details that must all be brought into alignment for the siege to succeed. And then, one day, the ramp is done. The engineers have been working toward this moment for weeks, and now it has arrived, and they stand at the base of the ramp, looking up at it. It is a great, broad slope of packed earth and stone, rising gently from the plain to the level of the wall, and it looks, in the morning light, almost natural, as though it had been there for 1,000 years, as though the wall had been built against a hill that happened to be there. The engineers feel a strange sensation. Part of it is pride, part of it is relief, and part of it, if they are honest with themselves, is a kind of loss. The ramp is finished. The work of building it is over. The men will move on to the next task, the towers, the final assault, and the ramp will be left behind, a monument to their patience, a hill that will stand for centuries, a reminder of the time when the Assyrians came and refused to go away. But the siege is not over. The towers must be rolled into place. The rams must be brought to bear. The wall must be breached. And so we return to the sound of the thud, the endless thud of the ram against the brick, and we let it fill our minds as we settle deeper into our chairs. The engineers are there, outside the walls, doing their work with the same calm, careful hands they have always used. The soldiers are there, pulling the ropes, chanting their work songs, dreaming of home. The defenders are there, on the other side of the wall, listening, waiting, hoping. And we are here, in the quiet of our own room, watching it all from a safe distance, feeling the pull of the story, the slow, patient rhythm of a siege that has been going on for a long time and will go on for a while longer. It is a strange thing to think about the past in this way. It is a strange thing to feel a kind of tenderness for the men who built the ramp and the ram, who lived in the camp and dug the latrines and sang the work songs and sat by the fires at night. They were part of a war machine, a brutal imperial force that crushed cities and enslaved people and carved boasts into stone. But they were also human beings, with all the complexity and contradiction that humanity implies. They were fathers and sons and brothers. They were skilled workers, proud of their craft. They were tired and hungry and bored and homesick. They were men who, on a quiet night, with the stars above and the camp around them, might have looked up at the sky and wondered, with a pang of longing, whether the same stars were shining over the fields and villages where they had been born. And perhaps the most human thing about them, the thing that makes them reach across the centuries and touch something in us, is their patience. They were willing to wait. They were willing to build a hill, day by day, basket by basket, for weeks on end, to achieve their goal. They were willing to sit outside a city and hammer at its walls, thud, 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 for as long as it took. They did not expect the world to change overnight. They understood that some things take time, and they had the strength, the endurance, the stubborn, quiet persistence to wait. In a world that is always rushing, always in a hurry, always wanting everything now, there is something deeply soothing about their example. They remind us that slow is okay, that patience is a power, that the steady accumulation of small efforts can move mountains, or at least build them. Let us imagine now that the camp has gone to sleep. It is deep in the night, the hour when the fires have burned down to coals, and the sentries walk their posts with heavy eyes, and the air is cool and still. The engineer is awake, but he is not working. He is standing at the edge of the camp, a little way from his tent, looking at the city. The city is dark, but the wall is just visible, a dark mass against the slightly lighter sky. The ramp is visible too, a broad, dark shadow rising toward the wall. The engineer looks at it, and he feels a quiet satisfaction. It is good work, he tells himself. It is solid work. It will hold. And then he looks up at the stars, and he lets his mind drift, just for a moment, away from the siege, away from the camp, away from the wall and the ramp and the ram. He thinks about his own home, perhaps, the house he built with his own hands, the garden where he grew vegetables, the woman who waited for him, the children who had grown up and moved away. He wonders if he will see them again. He hopes so, but he does not dwell on it, because dwelling on it would make the work harder, and the work must go on. He turns, and he walks back to his tent, and he lies down on his mat, and he closes his eyes. The sound of the ram has stopped for the night, and the camp is quiet. The engineer breathes slowly, deeply, steadily. He is asleep, and he is dreaming, we can imagine, of walls. Not walls that resist, but walls that give way. Walls that crumble at his touch, like dry earth. Walls that open like doors and welcome him in. He dreams of the city and the streets beyond the gate and the faces of the people who live there. He dreams of peace, perhaps, the strange peace that comes after a long struggle, the silence when the thud, thud, thud has finally stopped. And in the dream, he stands on the top of the wall, looking down at the camp, and the camp is empty, and the ramp is just a hill, and the grass is growing over it, and the world is at peace. And we, too, are near that place of peace. We are resting in our chairs, and our eyes are heavy, and our thoughts are softening into the blurred, comfortable edges of sleep. The story of the Assyrian siege engineers is quieting us, settling us, like a lullaby told in a low voice in a dark room. We can let go of the details now. We can let go of the ramps and the towers and the battering rams. We can let go of the names and the dates and the battles. What remains is something simpler, something that does not require us to remember anything at all. It is just the image of a camp and a wall and a hill that was built by hand, basket by basket, by men who were tired and hungry and far from home. A wall that stood against that hill for a time and then was worn away, and the night folding over everything, soft as a blanket, quiet as a held breath. Let us follow the engineer into his dream. Let us climb, in our imagination, to the top of the ramp. The slope is gentle, and the path is broad, and the climb is easy. With each step, we leave behind the noise and the dust and the labor of the camp. With each step, the view widens. We can see the city below us, the rooftops and the courtyards and the gardens and the narrow streets. We can see the smoke rising from the hearth fires, and we can hear, faintly, the sounds of a city going about its quiet business. We can see the camp behind us, the tents and the fires and the sentries, but it seems smaller now, less important. We can see the land beyond the camp, the fields and the roads, and the distant blue shape of the hills on the horizon. And we can see the sky, the enormous sky, full of stars, turning slowly, patiently, above the old and weary earth. And then we are at the top of the ramp, and we are level with the wall, and we can step across easily onto the parapet. There is no one there to stop us. The defenders have gone, perhaps withdrawn to their families, perhaps surrendered, perhaps simply dissolved into the past. We walk along the wall, and we look down at the city, and we feel that strange and beautiful sense of being at a boundary, a threshold between two worlds. Behind us is the camp and the army and the long, patient work of the siege. Ahead of us is the city and its people, and the life that will continue after we are gone. And we stand there between the two, and we do not have to choose. We can simply stand and look and breathe. The air is cool and clean. The stars are bright. The night is quiet, except for the soft sound of our own breathing, and the distant, rhythmic sound of something far away, a thud, 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 like a heartbeat in the earth. But it is growing softer now, growing fainter, like a memory. It is the sound of the siege, and it is fading, fading, fading into the long, deep calm of the past. We do not need to follow it. We can let it go. We can let the thud become a pulse, and the pulse become a rhythm, and the rhythm become a lullaby, and the lullaby become silence. And in the silence, we are at peace. So stay here for a little while longer. Stay on the wall, in the dream, with the stars above and the city below, and the camp behind you. Let the cool air wash over your face. Let the quiet settle into your bones. The siege is over, or it has not yet begun, or it never quite happened, outside the bounds of a story told on a quiet night to a sleepy listener. But the camp is there, and the wall is there, and the ramp is there, all of them waiting, patient, still, in the soft and endless darkness. And you are there too, resting, unhurried, drifting, as the world turns slowly beneath the stars, and the story holds you gently in its hands. We could end here, and it would be a good place to end. But the night is still young, and the story is not quite finished, and there are a few more things worth remembering before we let our heads drop and our eyes close. Let us turn, then, away from the dream and walk back down the ramp and re-enter the camp and see what the morning will bring. The sky is beginning to lighten in the east, just a little, a pale gray glow above the dark horizon. The men are stirring. The fires are being rekindled. The engineer is awake, and he is standing at the edge of the camp, looking at the wall, and his eyes are clear and calm and ready. The work will begin again soon. The baskets will swing. The picks will rise and fall. The ram will resume its patient thud, and the siege will continue in all its slow, majestic, exhausting inevitability, until one day the wall falls and the gate opens and the city is taken, and the engineers pack up their tools and move on to the next challenge. But that day is not today. Today is a day of work, and the work is the same as yesterday and the same as tomorrow. The engineers know this, and they do not mind. There is a comfort in the sameness, a security in the routine. They know what they are supposed to do, and they do it, and the world makes sense. There is no hurry, because there is nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. The wall is the wall, and the ramp is the ramp, and the camp is the camp, and the men are the men, and the hours pass, one after another, like the grains of earth that fill the baskets, an infinite and patient stream. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the siege engineers, the lesson that comes to us through the long, dusty ages, the lesson that we can carry with us into our own quiet lives. It is a simple lesson, and it is this: the work is the work. The wall is the wall. The day is the day. We do not need to rush. We do not need to be famous. We do not need to conquer anything or build anything or prove anything. We only need to be present, to pay attention, to do the next small thing that is in front of us, and to trust that all those small things, accumulated over time, will form a shape, a structure, a life. The hill is built basket by basket. The siege is won day by day. The story is told word by word. And you, resting here listening, are part of the story, part of the slow, patient unfolding of the world. And there is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do except be here, now, breathing, calm, and open to the quiet wonder of it all. The light grows in the east. The camp wakes. The engineer picks up his stick and walks toward the ramp. The basket men stretch and yawn and take up their loads. The rammers take their places at the ropes. And the thud, thud, thud begins again, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the ancient world, reaching forward through time to touch us, to soothe us, to carry us gently into the long, slow, dreaming night. The thud, thud, thud is steady now, like a heartbeat, like a drum, like the pulse of the earth itself. And here is a strange thing about the sound of work on a siege. It becomes, after a time, almost like silence. The men who hear it all day long do not hear it at all. They move with it, they breathe with it, they dream with it, and the thud becomes a kind of companion, a quiet presence, like the ticking of a clock in a house where everyone is asleep. And so the morning passes, and the ramp grows, and the men work without thinking about the work, because they have done it so many times before. The engineer walks among them, tapping his stick against the ground, nodding, sometimes stopping to watch a basket of earth being lifted up the slope, sometimes kneeling to press his hand against the face of the ramp, feeling for softness, feeling for weakness, as a cook might test a loaf of bread. He does not need to say much. He has been doing this since before most of these men were born, and his hands know what his eyes cannot always see. A slope that looks fine from a distance may be treacherously loose near the top. A foundation that seems solid may be full of hidden gaps, waiting for rain, waiting for weight, waiting for the moment when the rammers put all their strength into their ropes, and the whole thing shudders. And so he tests, and he prods, and he adjusts, patient as a gardener. There is a gentle humor in the thought of the engineer testing his ramp this way, but it is a true image and a comforting one. He is not a man of grand gestures. He is not a king, not a general, not a hero. He is a man who knows how to move earth, and how to make a ramp stand, and how to build a tower that will not fall over. And in a world full of things that fall over, that is no small thing. It is, perhaps, one of the most important things there is. We build our lives, all of us, on ramps of one kind or another, on foundations that we cannot see, and we trust that the earth will hold, that the slope will stand, that the tower will not topple. And most of the time, because of people like the engineer, it does not. The ramp that he is building is not a simple pile of dirt, though it may look like one from a distance. It is a structure, a work of craft, and it has layers like a cake or like the rings of a tree. At the bottom, where the ground is firm, the engineers laid a bed of large stones, packed tight and level. Above that came a layer of earth, carried in baskets, basket after basket, day after day, until the surface was smooth. Then came a layer of wooden beams, thick logs laid side by side, like the floor of a house, and on top of those, more earth, and then another layer of beams, and so on, rising slowly, patiently, step by step. Why the beams? Because the earth alone would shift and slide under the weight of the tower and the ram, especially when the ground was damp or sandy. The beams gave the ramp a spine, a skeleton, something to hold the shape together. They were the hidden bones of the hill, and the engineers knew that a ramp is not just a mountain of dirt. It is a path, a road, a bridge between the ground and the wall, and it must be strong enough to hold not only the weight of many men, but the weight of their greatest machines. And what machines they were! The battering ram was not a simple log swung by hand, though that is how it may appear in the reliefs, in the carved stone records of the Assyrian palaces. It was a monstrous thing, a long, heavy beam with a metal head, shaped sometimes like the head of a spear, sometimes like a blunt fist, and it was hung from ropes inside a wooden frame, so that it could swing forward and backward without the men having to lift it. The frame was covered with hides, wet and raw, to protect it from fire arrows and from the burning oil that the defenders might pour down from above. Inside the frame, sheltered and safe, the rammers pulled the ropes and let the beam swing, and each swing ended with a heavy thud against the face of the wall, a sound that must have traveled through the stone like a heartbeat, a sound that the defenders must have felt in their own chests, in their teeth, in the soles of their feet. And above the ram, on top of the tower, were the archers. The tower was tall, built in sections at the camp, and then rolled forward on wooden wheels, or carried piece by piece, and assembled at the face of the ramp. From the top, the archers could look down into the city, could see the defenders crowding the battlements, could pick them off with their arrows, one by one, while the men below continued their slow, steady work. There must have been a strange rhythm to it all. The arrows flying, the ram thudding, the baskets swinging, the picks rising and falling, the voices of men calling to one another in shouts that became, over time, a kind of music. Not a beautiful music, perhaps, not the kind you would hum on a summer evening, but a music nonetheless, a music of purpose and labor, and the slow, sure approach of a conclusion. Think of the camp, and you will see that it was not just a collection of tents. It was a small town, a city of its own, with streets and storehouses and kitchens and workshops. There were the men who baked the bread, and the men who brewed the beer, and the men who sharpened the tools, and the men who patched the leather, and the men who cared for the mules and the oxen that dragged the wagons and the carts. There were the metal workers who kept the rams in good repair, and the carpenters who built the towers and the ladders, and the weavers who made the baskets by the thousand, and the rope makers who twisted the fibers into strong, thick cords. The siege was not a single craft but many crafts, all woven together, and at the center of it all was the engineer, the man who knew how to fit the pieces into a whole. He did not do everything himself, and he did not need to. He knew that the camp was like a body, and that each man was a limb, a hand, an eye, and that if all the parts worked together, the body would move forward, slow and unstoppable, until it reached the wall. And here we may pause for a moment to consider the strange economics of a siege. The camp consumed enormous quantities of food and water and firewood, and all of it had to be brought in from outside, from the farms and villages of the surrounding country, or from the long supply lines that stretched back to the Assyrian homeland. The army could not simply sit in front of the city and wait forever. They had to feed themselves, and that meant that the countryside for miles around was scoured for every scrap of grain, every head of cattle, every jar of oil. The locals, if they were wise, had fled long before the army arrived, taking their stores with them, leaving the fields bare and the granaries empty. If they were not wise, or if they had nowhere to flee, they found themselves pressed into service, hauling baskets, driving wagons, digging trenches, doing the endless humdrum work that kept the siege alive. They were not soldiers, and they did not want to be there, but the machinery of war had scooped them up, and there was no way out except through the long, patient grind of the days. There is something almost absurd about the scale of it. To take one city with one wall, the Assyrians would build a ramp the size of a hill, fill it with a mountain of earth, and consume the resources of the entire surrounding region. And yet, from the perspective of the engineers, this was not absurd at all. It was simply the most efficient way to do the job. They did not have gunpowder. They did not have cannons. They had only their hands, their tools, their patience, and their knowledge. And their knowledge told them that any wall could be overcome if you were willing to spend enough time and enough earth. The wall was stone, and stone is hard, but stone is also finite. It has a height, a thickness, a place where it ends. And the ramp could always be made higher. The ramp could always be made thicker. The ramp could always be made longer, stretching and growing day by day, basket by basket, until it rose above the parapet and poured over the top like a slow, inevitable flood. The wall was a fixed point. The earth was infinite. And in the long, slow arithmetic of siegecraft, infinity always wins. The king, meanwhile, watched from his tent, seated on his throne, surrounded by his courtiers, his scribes, his captains. He did not do the work. He did not carry the baskets. He did not pull the ropes. But he was there, and his presence was important because it told the men that the siege mattered, that the city was worth the effort, that their labor would be seen and remembered. The Assyrian kings were great chroniclers of their own deeds. They carved their victories into stone, in the palaces, in the temples, in the cliffs, along the roads. And if you look at those carvings today, you will see the ramps and the towers and the battering rams, and you will see the engineers, and you will see the prisoners being led away, and you will see the king, standing or seated, calm and magnificent, watching it all unfold. He is the center of the picture, the one for whom the whole spectacle exists. But the picture would be nothing without the engineers, without their patient, unhurried craft. Perhaps the king understood this in his way. He must have known that the glory of the conquest belonged to him, but that the conquest itself belonged to the men who built the ramp and swung the ram and carried the earth. And so he saw that they were fed, and that they were paid, and that they were given a share of the plunder when the city finally fell. They were not honored with statues or songs, not that we know of, but they were respected in the way that practical men respect other practical men, by being given the tools they needed and the time to use them. There is a certain kindness in that, a certain quiet dignity. The king did not pretend that the engineers were his friends, but he knew what they were worth, and he treated them accordingly. Time passes strangely in a siege. The days blend together, each one like the last, and before you know it, weeks have gone by, and then months, and the ramp has grown from a low mound into a broad, sloping hill, and the camp has become as permanent as the city itself. The men have made little gardens, maybe, between the tents, and they have grown used to the sounds and the smells and the rhythms of the place. They know the faces of the defenders on the wall, or at least the ones who come to the parapet to shoot arrows at them. They have given them nicknames. They have learned to predict when the arrows will come, and when they will stop, and when the defenders will light a fire and send a burning bundle rolling down the ramp, sputtering and smoking. The engineers have built shelters along the sides of the ramp so that the basket men can climb without being hit, and they have learned to move quickly in short bursts between one shelter and the next. The siege has become a routine, and routine has a way of making even the strangest things feel normal. But there are moments, usually in the evenings, when the work stops and the fire is lit and the men gather around it, and the routine falls away, and they remember that they are far from home. They remember their wives, their children, their fields, the smell of their own cooking fires, the sound of their own villages. They remember the faces of the people they have left behind, and they wonder, in the quiet way that men always wonder, whether those people are thinking of them, whether they are safe, whether they will ever return. The fire crackles. The stars come out. Someone begins to sing a slow, sad song, and the others join in, low and soft, and the song drifts across the camp, and the sentries on the wall hear it, and they listen, and they are a little bit calmer for the sound. The engineer sits apart, perhaps, or maybe he sits with them, and he does not sing, but he listens, and his eyes are old and tired and full of a kind of knowing. He has heard many such songs on many such nights in many different camps, and he knows that the songs end and the stars fade and the morning comes and the work begins again. But he also knows that the songs matter. They are what the men carry with them, the little piece of home that cannot be left behind, the thing that makes them human, even in the middle of a war. And now the night has deepened, and the fire is burning down, and the song has drifted into silence. The men are wrapped in their cloaks, sleeping, and the camp is quiet, and the only sound is the faint, far-off thud of a ram, still working, still patient, because the siege never completely sleeps. There's always someone awake, always someone watching, always someone working, even in the middle of the night. The engineer has made his rounds, and he is standing at the edge of the camp, looking up at the ramp, which looms dark against the sky. The ramp is almost high enough now, almost level with the top of the wall. In a few more days, perhaps, the tower will be rolled into place, and the rams will be positioned, and the final assault will begin. But for now, in the darkness, there is only the ramp, and the wall, and the city beyond, and the quiet breathing of the sleeping men. He is tired. And as he stands there, he feels the tiredness in his bones, a deep weariness that is not just from the day's work, but from all the days, all the sieges, all the ramps, all the years. He has seen so many cities fall. He has built so many hills of earth. He has stood at the edge of so many camps, at the end of so many days, and he has always known, with a certainty that is both a comfort and a weight, that there would be another city, another ramp, another hill. But tonight, for some reason, the certainty feels different. It feels less like a promise and more like a question. He wonders for a moment whether it matters, whether the ramps and the walls and the cities are worth all the years, whether anything he has built has made the world better, or whether it has only made it more broken. And then he looks at the ramp, at the long, smooth slope of it, and he remembers that the ramp was not built to break the world. It was built to break a wall. And behind the wall, there is a city, and in the city there are people. And when the wall falls, the people will surrender, and the fighting will stop, and the killing will stop, and there will be peace of a kind. The peace of submission, perhaps, but peace nonetheless. And he knows, in the quiet, practical way of a man who has spent his life building things, that peace is better than war, even when it is a peace that is imposed on the defeated. And he knows that his ramps have brought peace in their way, and that this is not nothing. It is, perhaps, the most a man can do. And so he turns, and he goes back to his tent, and he lies down, and he closes his eyes, and he sleeps. And in his sleep, he dreams again of the hill that he built, the hill that is now covered in grass, the hill that has become part of the landscape, so that no one remembers it was made by human hands. And in the dream, he is standing on the top of the hill, and the wall is gone, and the city is gone, and the camp is gone, and there is nothing there but grass and wind and sky. And he feels a great peace, a peace that is beyond all understanding, a peace that does not need to be explained or justified, a peace that is simply there, like the grass, like the wind, like the sky. And he understands, in the deep, wordless way of dreams, that this is the end of all sieges, not the fall of the city, not the victory of the king, but this, the ramp becoming a hill, the hill becoming a meadow, the meadow becoming a place where children play and sheep graze and lovers walk, hand in hand, without ever knowing the name of the engineer who laid the first basket of earth, who built the first layer of beams, who made all of it possible. And he is content with that. He is more than content. He is happy in a quiet, steady, enduring way, because he knows that his work has been folded into the earth, and the earth will hold it, and the earth will remember it, even when no one else does. And we too can rest now. We have walked with the engineer through his long day, and we have climbed his ramp, and we have stood on the wall, and we have looked out at the stars, and we have learned his lesson, or perhaps we have simply been soothed by his presence, and that is enough. The story is drawing to a close, and the night is deep, and our eyes are heavy, and the words are becoming softer, more distant, like the sound of the ram fading into the past. We do not need to hold onto any of it. We do not need to remember the names or the dates or the techniques. We can let the engineer go, back into his camp, back into his dream, back into the long, dusty ages where he dwells. A quiet figure, half remembered, barely visible, a ghost of work and patience and craft. We can let the ramp fade, let the wall fade, let the city fade, until there is nothing left but the hill, the gentle, grassy hill, rising softly in the distance, and the night, and the stars, and the sound of our own breathing, slow and calm and regular, like the tide, like a lullaby, like the heartbeat of the earth. And so the siege ends, not with a crash, not with a shout, not with the roar of conquest, but with a soft, quiet settling, a falling away of effort and purpose and noise, a gentle release into the arms of sleep. The engineer has gone to his rest, and the camp has gone to its rest, and the city has gone to its rest, and the king has gone to his rest, and all the long, ambitious, striving world of ancient Assyria has gone to its rest, and the dust has settled over everything, and the grass has grown, and the hill remains. And we remain, too, here in this quiet room, in this quiet moment, held by the story, soothed by the telling, drifting at last into the soft, deep, dreamless stillness that comes after a long and gentle tale. The lamp is low. The world is still. There is nothing more to do, and nothing more to say, and no further place to go. We are here, and here is enough. So let your head rest heavy on the pillow. Let your hands go loose and limp. Let your thoughts slow down, like water slowing in a wide, flat river, until they are almost still, almost silent, almost nothing. The story is over. The work is done. The hill is built, and the hill is green, and the hill is at peace, and you are at peace, and all is well, and all is well, and all is well. Good night, dear listener. Good night, and sleep deeply, and dream of quiet hills.